Good evening, and welcome to this Institute for Historical Research Partnership Seminar, which is co-convened by the Engelsberg Applied History Programme at the Centre for Grant Strategy at King's College London and the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge University, and by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office historians. I'm Brendan Sims, the Director of the Centre for Geopolitics. Today is the fifth seminar of this series, and we will be discussing the geopolitics of trade and whether the origins of mercantilism can tell us anything about the future of international trade disputes. I'm delighted to be introducing our two speakers for today. Let me begin with Hugo Bromley of the University of Cambridge. Hugo is a PhD student at the university, studying English cloth producers and the rise of protectionism in late 17th and early 18th century Britain. His project aims to emphasize popular global origins of the English political economy, challenging our understanding of mercantilism. Hugo is also a research assistant in applied history at my own Centre for Geopolitics, having previously worked as a researcher at the International Financial Law Review and a reporter at IFLR Practice Insight. Now also joining us is our discussant, Mikael Wigell. Mikael is the Program Director in Global Security, Finnish, Foreign and Security Policy and Geoeconomics at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He is also Adjunct Professor in International Political Economy at the University of Tampere and Non-Resident Associate at the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. Mikael has published widely on issues relating to geoeconomics in power politics, including the Institute's latest briefing paper, released this month, on recognizing geoeconomic risk. Before we begin, I would like to mention that this session is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days at the links being shown in the chat. Now, Hugo will give his presentation for approximately 30 minutes, and then Mikael will respond. You may also ask questions throughout the event, and I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to do so. Please give your name and institution when sending in a question, institution if you have one, of course. You can submit them at any point throughout the event. I will do my best to get through as many as possible. Now, without any further ado, Hugo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brendan. And I'd like to thank the Engelsberg Applied History Programme, the Institute for Historical Research, the KCL Grant Strategy Centre, and the Foreign Office historians for making this event possible. So this is a paper about mercantilism, and mercantilism is one of those words that gets more confusing the more you look at it. To many, it's simply another word for protectionism, for states that take an active role in the manipulation of international trade in favour of domestic industry. Certainly, that's how it's frequently used in a modern context, particularly when referring to China's development and the recent return away from some aspects of free trade. International relations has embraced concepts of geoeconomics and strategic capitalism to refer to how states can shape international flows of capital and resources to serve geopolitical objectives. To many early modern historians, it is inherently bound into colonialism and the exploitation of the Americas and the forced creation
I think that Hugo's screen is frozen. Will you excuse us for a moment, please? We'll try and get him back.
Hi, can people hear me?
We can now, yes, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'll just go back half a sentence. To economic historians, mercantilism is a crucial battlefield in the war over the cause of the Industrial Revolution, particularly for some schools of development economics, for whom British mercantilism is the first in a series of developments through infant industry protection that also contains 19th century America late 19th century Germany and Sweden, and Japan and South Korea in the 20th century. Part of the reason for this confusion lies in the fact that the word mercantilism derives from one of its critics rather than its supporters. It is famously a portmanteau of Adam Smith's mercantile system. Smith criticized the mercantile system as one in which elite manufacturers and merchants persuaded the government to adopt protectionist measures, particularly through an obsession with bullionism and colonial trade, that benefited a small minority at the expense of the working people of Britain. It is important to note that it was not protectionism in all its forms that Smith was criticizing, but the process by which it was adopted. Smith himself supported the Navigation Acts, which required goods to be transported on English ships on national security grounds, and he also supported tariffs, low tariffs and not a ban on raw wool exports, both central tenets of protectionist English political economy. The person Smith perceived as wronged by mercantilism was not only the consumer, but also the poor producer. As he put it, whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its councillors are always the masters. These masters then, in Smith's view, captured the state and, in his reading, immediately sought state support for their monopolies on particular products. Various attempts have been made to find a coherent definition of mercantilism in policy terms since, over the years, emphasizing unified internal markets, balance of trade theory, or corporate trading monopolies. All, however, have struggled with the fact that the mercantile system referred primarily to a process of policy formation, rather than to any particular policy. Though Smith spoke in general of the benefits of a free market and free trade, this was not central to his criticism. In fact, Smith's conceptualization implies, though he very much does not state, that measures we now call pro-market could in fact be mercantilist if they were adopted by the state against its own interests, thanks to the corporate capture of state institutions. Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, half a century after the key period in the development of English political economy, following the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The cornerstones of England's mercantilism develops in a period of relatively competitive elections and astonishing levels of popular engagement with issues of trade policy. This paper analyzes two major moments in that period: the rejection of the French Commercial Treaty of 1713 and the Calico Acts of 1700 and 1721, in the context of both European geopolitics and global commerce. In both cases, what triumphed was in effect a rejection of the value of geopolitics in international trade policy. Rather, England's mercantilism was driven by a common belief that the purpose of international trade was to secure domestic employment. In Britain's case, the increased role of Parliament and the vibrancy of the national conversation over trade led to a remarkably subtle and developed programme of economic protectionism, which may, and for this paper I'm going to leave it at may, have contributed significantly to Britain's industrial development. In conclusion, I will explore the lessons we can take from this period of history when considering international trade disputes today. So let's begin with the failure of the 1713 Treaty of Commerce. It was signed as part of wider peace negotiations accompanying the Treaty of Utrecht, and it reset tariffs between Britain and France to the more favourable rates of 1667, except for on 4 products, including, crucially, wool and cloth, which remained at a higher rate. The treaty was put forward by the then Tory government, but was defeated primarily by a large rebellion of Tory-aligned members of Parliament, who accounted for 40% of the MPs to vote against the treaty. Opposition or support for the treaty became the defining issue of the election that followed. Given the power of the incumbent government at that time to control the democratic process, the Tories were again returned, yet were unable to reintroduce the treaty to the Commons, and the bill languished until the change of government following the death of Queen Anne. Several historians, including Stephen Pincus and Duanan, have interpreted debates over the treaty as part of a geopolitical debate over whether Britain's primary rival in continental Europe was the Dutch, as was believed by many leading Tories and some of their cheerleaders in the popular press, or the French. Certainly, those responsible for the treaty itself were thinking in geopolitical terms. To leading Tory figures such as Harley and Bolingbroke, the treaty was an attempt to both encourage lasting peace with France through a closer trading relationship, and to limit Dutch strength by preventing a closer Dutch-French relationship, which they viewed as a major threat. Economically, they were supported in their designs by many wealthier city merchants who viewed France as a key re-export market for new global products. However, a close study of the petitions, pamphlets, and speeches around the treaty demonstrates that, in fact, the main objections had nothing to do with the Netherlands at all, but with Portugal. The Methuen Treaty of 1703 had given British woolen producers privileged access to the Portuguese market and, by extension, its colonial territories, notably Brazil. In return, Portugal received a commitment that Portuguese wine would always face a tariff 2/3 less than French wine. The cloth trades to Spain and Italy similarly relied on English purchases of wine and other luxury products to provide capital for purchases of English cloth. Since the new Treaty of Commerce would violate the terms of the Methuen Treaty, there was huge opposition to the Treaty of Commerce from the generally quite small cloth producers whose exports depended on the trade with Portugal. The petition of the clothiers of the villages of Trowbridge, Frome and Bradford in Somerset were typical in their view that the treaty would, and I quote, induce Portugal to prohibit or lay a high duty on the woolen manufacturers of Great Britain to the utter ruin of that trade. 43 petitions in 2 months were presented to the House of Commons by weavers up and down the country, warning of the threat to cloth production the treaty presented. This concern was then picked up in pamphlets on trade, which were either printed by the clothiers themselves or the various famous hired pens of the time. Swift and Defoe got involved, in fact. Finally, the Portugal trade dominated debate in the Commons. Sir Thomas Hanmer, the Tory rebel who was widely seen as having swung the debate against the treaty, cited the Portugal trade as his primary concern. The political debate over trade was facilitated by a near universal understanding that the purpose of international trade was to support domestic employment in manufacturing. Consumerism, as we will learn, was a fringe and widely attacked viewpoint. This focus on manufacturing employment in fact reflected economic realities of an English economy caught between increasing agricultural efficiency, limited industrialization, and once high, though now stagnant, population growth. It was also closely tied to the English welfare system, the Poor Law, where individuals contributed to a parish fund to support those most in need. Popular thinking therefore prioritized those industries, particularly textile manufacturing, that had the capacity to, quote, sustain large numbers in work, ahead of luxury global re-exports that generated very little domestic employment. This meant that luxury exporters had little purchase in the national debate unless they tried to sort of shift things around a little bit. In 1700, for example, the Royal Africa Company's ivory traders defended their trade not on the basis of the huge increases it gave to England's export figures or the colonial power it sustained, but the employment it created for the ivory carvers of Bristol. This focus on manufacturing employment extended to the electoral politics of the time, as such as they were. Both Whig and Tory desperately sought to claim the mantle of champion of woolen cloth, using crude but somewhat endearing campaigning techniques. The Tories staged a procession for our manufacturers through the centre of Leicester, with the volunteers wearing raw wool headbands. The Whigs of Norwich went for a more direct approach and released 100 sheep to roam through the town centre. This economic framework gave particular weight to petitions from semi-rural manufacturing communities who could claim to speak on behalf of large numbers of employees. Petitions frequently contained hundreds of signatures, from the highly legible to the ill-formed to a historian today, and they were passed around manufacturing communities to people's workmen to increase their size. Since petitions were presented in person, organizing one required some financial means, but it is notable that none of the woolen petitioners could afford to stay in London for the entire period of debate. When Parliament asked for follow-up discussions a month after many of the petitions were submitted, they found that they'd all had to go back to the villages and towns they came from. In the formation of England's mercantilism, manufacturing interests were more than elite lobbies. They included those at the heart of England's semi-rural manufacturing economy. The fundamental reason for the failure of the Tory treaty were twofold, really. First, the Treaty of Methuen had created a flourishing export market in Portugal, and particularly Portuguese overseas colonies, that was threatened by the treaty. Secondly, although the treaty did open up France to new luxury imports from England's ever more global trading relationships, the Tory government could not present France as an exciting new market for more politically and economically significant products like textiles, partly because France has its own domestic production, but above all because tariffs on woolen textiles were not included in the treaty. At the end of a titanic and ultimately successful conflict, the Tory government had signed an economically unequal treaty in return for the perceived geopolitical benefits of trade supporting a political rapprochement with an adversary. However, the balance of interests in England and the presence of a common economic understanding eventually prevented the treaty from taking effect. The subsequent development of British trade demonstrates perhaps the wisdom of the House of Commons' approach. Britain's trade surplus with Portugal, which would have been all but halted if the Treaty of Commerce had been ratified, grew exponentially. By the 1750s, Britain's trade surplus with Portugal and Brazil amounted to 1.2% of Britain's total gross domestic product, and about 1/8 of the total British export trade. In one of economic history's most remarkable ironies, the trade between Britain and Portugal became so successful that it was used a century later by David Ricardo to demonstrate the principle of comparative advantage. You may have heard of this, right? English cloth for Portuguese wine. Ricardo must himself have been aware of the Methuen Treaty, if only because it is quoted and criticized at length by Adam Smith for diverting rather than creating trade. That he chose to ignore the preferential tariff arrangements that made trade between England and Portugal originally possible is, perhaps given his argument, unsurprising. So, in terms of significance in the development of popular English political economy, the 1713 Treaty of Commerce is surpassed only by the Calico Acts, which were passed in 1700 and 1721, respectively. And it's here that we must consider the institution that to us is most associated with English mercantilism in many ways, the East India Company. In the late 17th century, the company began to focus on the production of Indian textiles in India for export to Europe. Chowdhury estimates that at the height of this, the Indian textile trade amounted to 86% of company incomes before the Calico Acts. Their rationale was simple. India had cheap access to a new global raw material in cotton and much cheaper, relatively skilled labor. The company therefore set about a deliberate strategy of undermining the English textile industry by pursuing what we would now call a lost leader strategy. In 1682, factories in Madras were tasked with producing 200,000 shirts for import. That's enough to clothe about half the men in London in the time, so it's 2% of the national consumption of shirts in England. A second lost leader in 1689 asked for them to be, quote, strong and substantially sewed for poor peoples. The East India Company behaved in a way entirely recognizable to us today, using free trade to capture a home consumer market at the expense of domestic manufacturers and using cheap labor abroad. This behavior was initially accepted by the state, in part thanks, it must be said, to the considerable bribes paid to members of parliament by the EIC. But popular pressure eventually led to the passing of two Calico Acts. The first act banned Indian products with the exception of those dyed in England before sale, and the second banned them entirely. So, maintaining a multinational footprint had benefits to the East India Company beyond simple labor costs. For the EIC, it gave greater control and greater capacity to influence consumer behavior. The company sent English drapers and designers to India to teach their own workforce overseas the kinds of styles that would sell well in England, a mixture of English styles and exoticized, quote, Oriental patterns, often inspired by Chinese rather than Indian culture, taking advantage of superior dyes in India to create garish contrasting colors. This is known as the bazaar style of silk. You can still see it at the V&A, actually. For their higher priced products, the East India Company took advantage of the fact that their product arrived all at once with the India fleet to create what we now know as the annual fashion cycle. EIC shareholders were encouraged to bring their wives to the dock so that they could be the first to purchase and wear the new products. Could we get the first image up, please? Okay, I'm gonna keep going, and then I'll stop once the image is shared on the screen and we can talk about it. The conceptualization of international, here we go. So just click on image 3 there. Okay, all right, we'll leave the images. What you would have seen is an Indian, here we go, great. So this is a piece of calico that was imported from India into London in the 1690s. I think it might have been re-exported, it's difficult to tell. You can see there that it's depicting an English gentleman and his wife, probably on a picnic. And they are very much dressed as English people. You can see the very typical early 18th century, late 17th century wig and the hairdo. So that's an English design, probably designed by an English designer in India that has then been produced there and re-imported back into England. All right, thank you. The conceptualization of international trade as a process for providing manufacturing employment facilitated a widespread debate on the impact of the EIC's actions. At times, this was corrupted by the violent politics of gender in the 18th century. Before the passage of the Second Act, female consumers were attacked in the streets of London and stripped of any Indian calico they were wearing by violent weavers, to the condemnation of many, including those who supported the act. The calico madam, quote, became a symbol of global consumption. The views of those women who bought calico are largely lost to history, mostly due to the patriarchal structures of the time. It's important to note, however, that the debate pitted producers against consumers rather than men against women. Whole families took part in the protests, particularly before the passage of the First Act. In 1698, the house of a senior East India Company merchant was attacked by women weavers holding babies over their heads to protest the cruelty of Indian imports. More significantly for parliamentary debate, over 160 petitions on both instances from across the country emphasized the loss of employment Indian cloth caused in areas producing lighter woolen fabrics, known as the new draperies. In both debates, employment was linked again primarily to welfare, to poor relief, and ultimately the social health of the nation as a whole. Petitions again lamented the decline of the English woolen industry had caused their own communities to collapse. This is actually where we see what I think is one of the first ever uses of the word patriotism directly in relation to these debates. Pamphlets printed in support of both acts used to list the numbers of people, quote, sustained by one pack of wool being manufactured into cloth. Since many MPs were landowners, there was some tailoring of arguments that also emphasized the role of manufacturing in sustaining rent levels in semi-rural communities. If we could have the second image, if that's okay. Great. So this is a cartoon that was printed at the time. I've been calling them the Calico Acts for ease of use. Their official name was the Acts for the More Effectual Employment of the Poor and Encouraging the Manufactures of this Kingdom. This cartoon was printed to celebrate the publication of the Act, and you can see around the outside all of the professions that the Act was supposedly securing in their trade, from the weaver to the farmer to the person who owned the pub near where they were working. Okay. The company itself did not fully commit to a consumerist argument in support of their trade. They even won political support in 1693 by buying 200,000 woolen cloths for export into Persia and India, which they were largely unable to sell. They ended up rotting in warehouses in Isfahan, actually. Yet it was in fact the East India Company and their paid supporters in 18th century print, half a century before The Wealth of Nations was published, who first advanced the argument in public and in private to the Board of Trade that free trade was necessary to provide cheaper goods to the poor. Why should we prohibit wearing East India manufactures, which are so cheap, to encourage the wearing of our own, which are much dearer? Asked one pro-company pamphlet. 1 month after that pamphlet was published, a response emerged in the popular press with a simple response. The cheaper they are, the more damage they do to our own growth and manufactures, and therefore the more necessary and reasonable to be prohibited. The East India Company also defended the trade on the basis of profitability. The response was equally clear. If the trade is possible, the pamphlet declared, if the trade is profitable, rather, it is only so to some private persons and not to the nation. The East India Company's least successful justification for the Calico Act was that they were required to maintain the British position in India against French and Dutch influence. The company argued that profits accruing from the trade were crucial to maintain forts and factories on the subcontinent. Yet since India was not at the time seen as a potential market for English products, the whole value of the company's presence at all was called into question in popular debate and occasionally in the Commons. In fact, several pamphlets criticized the immorality of the company's actions in India, notably in the Anglo-Mughal War of 1686-90. The openness of the debate, reaching communities from Halifax in Yorkshire to Exeter in Devon, allowed policy to be tailored to the specific needs of the British economy. Linens, which were also increasingly competing with English woolens and silks, were left free throughout the period of any restrictions at all, out of concern for employment and stability in Scotland and Ireland, where linen production was more prominent. Irish linen exports doubled between 1718 and 1734. The initial arrival of Indian calicos had sparked the development of England's own calico printing industry as well. In the run-up to the First Act, dyers across the country petitioned that the most technically advanced aspects of their trade, many of which they had not yet fully mastered, relied on white cotton textiles imported from India that could not yet be produced domestically. A study of parliamentary debate and private accounts reveals that white cottons were exempted from the treaty as a direct result of their petition. In 1720 to 21, British calico printing techniques were far more advanced and their campaign against the act far less persuasive. More importantly, as a concession to both the East India Company and to the increasing number of British drapers and merchants who relied on the Atlantic trade, Parliament kept the American colonies, then a small but growing market, open to Indian calico imports. As the economic historians O'Brien, Griffiths, and Hunt have argued, this allowed British cotton industries to develop within the security of the home market, while competition for America with Indian imports encouraged product innovation. In a time period when data on the economy was so unreliable as to be virtually worthless, the state's engagement with businesses large and small across the country facilitated a remarkably sophisticated policy design process. Comparing Britain's approach to Indian textiles with those taken by Holland and France reveals how different political institutions can create different responses to the threat of free trade or protectionism, in this case, of course, Indian production. Under Louis XIV and his famous minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, France had adopted a highly state-centered form of mercantilism and economic decision-making, which shunned participation from the wider economy in favor of government inspectors or intendants who provided reports to the state. The French were among the first nations to ban calico imports, with the Marquis de Louvois introducing an initial ban in 1681 to protect French industry. That's 20 years before the first Calico Act. French industry in textile production remained relatively strong, yet without access for Indian calicos at all, French dyeing and printing techniques fell far behind those of England. In Holland, clothiers of Haarlem had petitioned against Indian imports as early as 1642. Such proposals fell on largely deaf ears, however, thanks to the influence of the Dutch East India Company, who were far more integrated into the Dutch state than their English counterparts. Holland became the only country in Europe to provide no protection at all to its textile industry from any Indian imports. So, in conclusion, researching and presenting this paper caused me to think of a very famous quote in some circles from the Italian economic historian Carlo Cipolla, who once remarked that, quote, "It was fortunate for England that no Indian Ricardo arose to convince the English people that according to the law of comparative costs, it would be advantageous for them to turn into shepherds and import from India all of the textiles that were needed." Yet, in fact, an early version of Ricardo was present in contemporary debate in the form of the East India Company itself. It's another of economic history's ironies that the EIC, who are so often held up as the primary example of mercantilism, were in fact the people who took the first steps in British history towards what we now call neoclassical economics. The company's failure to successfully pursue the strategy common among multinationals today was the consequence of its inability to successfully win the support of the English and later British state. Indeed, common understanding of political economy and relatively open governmental systems within a very clear historical context, I should add, created a pressure in favor of small producers and national manufacturing employment that was prioritized above both consumption and geopolitical objectives. So, what lessons can we take from the creation of England's political economy in this period? The complexities of Indian trade and the failure of the 1713 Treaty of Commerce suggest that just as trade cannot be reduced to bilateral exchanges in the economic sense, what Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis have recently referred to as the Peter Navarro era, nor can individual trades between nations be isolated as part of a geopolitical strategy, necessarily. Importantly, this applies to trade liberalization and therefore attempts to create geoeconomic alliances, as much as it does to more protectionist measures. After the Industrial Revolution shifted the world economy away from simple organic sources of energy towards fossil fuels, a small number of resources have emerged which have little footprint in domestic production and can be used very, very effectively by the state, notably oil and natural gas. However, in the main, policy on international trade is still driven by the relationship between the state, including its geopolitical concerns, and mercantile and manufacturing interests, large and small, with consumers having a larger yet by no means dominant voice. The desire to change these relationships can be seen in many of the slogans developing across the Western world in regard to international relations, from building back better to Joe Biden and his advisors' recent advocacy of a, quote, foreign policy for the middle class. The history of mercantilism suggests that to change that balance in any way, either towards consumers or producers, states will have to reckon with the power of corporate influence over political decision-making, which is hardly a new or original finding. So there are some similarities between the global changes in international trade policy that took place in the 18th century and the moment we're in today. However, I tend to think that the differences are far more instructive when we think about how the domestic relationships that drive so much international trade policy have changed. When we look back to this period in political economy, the major, perhaps overwhelming difference between those times and ours is the emergence of economics as a scientific discipline, and its subsequent embrace of mathematical modeling and statistical correlation, what has been referred to as the probabilistic revolution. This has given economists new tools to understand the economy, but it has also created barriers that prevent millions of people from meaningfully engaging in the national economic debate. To regret those barriers may seem quaint, charming, or perhaps less flatteringly anti-intellectual. But as Brexit and Trump have shown, people have real opinions on trade policy and real experience of its effects, and they don't express those experiences in terms of econometrics. Successive popular movements around the democratic world have recently disrupted crucial geopolitical alliances in protest of the current state of the world economy, in part. As a result, we live in a period where liberal politicians and policymakers are being forced to reckon with what they often describe as voters' feelings. Feelings of being left behind by globalization, feelings that institutions they believe ought to have power in their economic and social existence have in fact lost control. At the other extreme, countries with political systems at least as authoritarian as Louis XIV's France are attempting to pursue statist development policies with no input from the wider population, and are therefore in fact at very high risk of capture, as Adam Smith described, by mercantile and manufacturing elites. Maybe there's a value, if we want to understand the changing world of international trade disputes today, in learning from a world where some ordinary employees and small employers not only had feelings, but could express them in ways that were accepted intellectually by those at the highest levels of political society. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And so now we turn to Mikael Wigell. You now have the floor for your response.
Well, thanks a lot. And first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to discuss this excellent text. I learned a lot from it myself, and it was a real joy to read. It's written in very clear prose, and it obviously deals with a topic in which there are many analogies to our current times and our current period, in which it seems that mercantilism is undergoing some sort of revival, perhaps. And as such, I think the subject matter here really makes for an excellent and pertinent study. I've just got a couple of points to point out, really. The first point has to do with the title of the paper, the Geopolitics of Trade. So to be slightly provocative, I actually don't find that much geopolitics in here. I might be a bit biased here, of course. I find some geoeconomics, but I don't find that much geopolitics. But I'll come to that a bit later. So starting, Hugo, from your analysis of the Calico Acts, to me, it reads like a pretty standard political economy analysis, with domestic politics being the biggest explanatory variable, right? So how popular pressure led to the passing of the Calico Acts against the kind of more free trade disposition of the East India Company, right? So it seems to me it was really a struggle over welfare gains, and the gains from trade, not really about any geopolitical aims, or using any geopolitical means. And by the way, the paragraph comparing with France and Holland, indeed, that seems like an interesting comparison to be made, I think, and that could probably be expanded a bit in subsequent work or something. At least I find that interesting also because there are some analogies to our times perhaps to find there as well, in sort of comparing models of capitalism, state capitalism versus free market capitalism, or what I like to call now the kind of the model in between, strategic capitalism, right? But not that much more about that. But nevertheless, I think this is pretty standard political economy as an analytical framework, and doesn't seem to involve that much geopolitics as a strategic practice. Now, the 1713 Treaty of Commerce is, to me, more interesting from a particularly from a geoeconomic perspective, right? Not so much geopolitics here either, but certainly geoeconomics. And let me here kind of invoke a sort of parenthesis on the differences between geopolitics and geoeconomics. If we first think of them as different strategic practices, we can say that whereas geopolitics involves I would put it like this, the geostrategic use of military means or military power, right? Geoeconomics involves the geostrategic use of economic power or economic instruments or economic means. So as a strategic practice, they are distinguished by their means, right? Not their aims. So geoeconomics is really about pursuing strategic objectives, including national security objectives, not by any military means, but by economic means. And this, of course, is a lot of what we see going on today in the new great power struggle between the US and China, in which a sort of new mercantilist policies are being used for national security purposes, to protect technological sovereignty or whatnot. That's a huge difference to the old Cold War, when strategic objectives were mainly, not exclusively, but mainly driven by military means. So traditional geopolitics more. This is also why I would be inclined to see mercantilism as a sort of under category of geoeconomics. Not geopolitics, because mercantilism is obviously a bundle of economic means applied to pursue strategic objectives, be they strictly national security ones or more welfare-oriented ones. So now coming back to your Treaty of Commerce here, that seems to me to be pure geoeconomics then. Here, the government attempts to use an economic mean, an economic instrument to pursue strategic objectives, the strategic objectives of peace with France, while simultaneously driving a wedge through the Dutch-French relationship, which constituted a threat to Britain, right? So the Treaty of Commerce was being planned as a facet of a geoeconomic strategy, just like we have seen trade agreements also later being pursued for political strategic objectives, for the purpose of alliance statecraft, for instance. In this case, as in many cases afterwards with trade agreements, look at the TTIP, the government failed to implement it because of domestic politics, because some domestic economic interest group, for instance, or popular opinion as such, did not appreciate the government's strategic reasoning and foreign policy strategy. Right? And this, the domestic politics variable, and this is my last very short point, it's perfectly in line with geoeconomics as an analytical framework. If we make a distinction here between geoeconomics as a strategic practice and then geoeconomics as an analytical framework. Because geoeconomics as an analytical framework, in contrast to structural realism and more in line with neoclassical realism, also looks at the domestic dimension of statecraft and the way it can limit and condition foreign policy statecraft. So what this analysis of the Treaty of Commerce shows us, and which is totally in line with geoeconomics as an analytical perspective, is that the state is not an unanimous, autonomous actor on its own, as often perceived by structural realism, but indeed that state-society relations condition its ability to pursue a foreign policy strategy. So to conclude, I find this paper to be an excellent geoeconomic analysis about geoeconomics, especially the Treaty of Commerce. And especially the first case study, so to speak, the Treaty of Commerce. I think it's an excellent kind of illustration of geoeconomics as both as a strategic practice and from the analytical perspective of geoeconomics. And this gives much more, this kind of historical analysis gives much depth also to our contemporary discussion on any new Cold War. Because foremost, if we are about to have a new Cold War, it's about to be happening. It seems to be happening in the economic domain and not in the military domain, right? So I think this sort of analysis gives a lot of depth to that discussion as well. And I try to be short here so to leave a lot of space to discussion as well. So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think that your two contributions, although you're obviously speaking on the one hand from a historian's point of view, on the other hand from a more political science, geoeconomics point of view, I think they show actually that this past is not remote, that we're seeing in the present day revival, as you say, Mikael, of mercantilism. And I was very struck listening to Hugo, just how unremote this past actually seems to us, although we should perhaps also ask ourselves whether that is not, in some sense, a false friend. And perhaps as an historian, Hugo, you will come back on that. But before we get into the questions, is there anything, Hugo, you'd like to respond to briefly in what Mikael has just said?
I think so, yeah. First of all, thank you very much for your response. In terms of the illusion of the title, which you brought up, I think the Calico Acts are an example of something that could have been seen in a geopolitical context, but wasn't. Britain's position in India you could easily view as a political posture to prevent French penetration of India, for example. You could perceive it that way. You could talk about it that way. People did talk about it that way. The problem is that had very little purchase and very little influence in domestic discourse. And I think that's something that is even more true of the Treaty of Commerce, of course, as you rightly identify. And I suppose the absence of geopolitics in this paper about geopolitics was almost my point, really, which is that when it comes to these debates, when it comes to these moments of international trade, we need to think about domestic economy much more, and we need to view these debates in a much more integrated way. And you bring up, Brendan, the difference between sort of history and political science and IR as different approaches to this. History and IR have drifted apart a little bit. I really think this is somewhere where global history and the innovations in global history that have taken place in the last, say, 20 years has a lot to offer in showing how foreign policy aspects and domestic policy aspects were integrated into one system in periods of high levels of globalization and increasing globalization. This is a moment of high and increasing globalization that we're talking about here, not at its height, but of increasing contact. And it's important to think of them as in an integrated way, particularly since, and to link this back to your new Cold War point, Mikael, if we look at an old Cold War in which economic systems were both structurally opposed in philosophy and in practice very, very much separated economies, we're going into, if you want to call it a new Cold War, a conflict where economies are far more integrated, where things are brought closer together. And as such, I think this is a moment where we have to pay much more attention to domestic concerns that would once have been the realm of domestic political economy. And I think we're seeing that with some of the approaches of Joe Biden in the last few weeks.
Thank you. Now, as Mikael quite rightly said, there wasn't as much geopolitics in your talk as one might think if one is attending an event organized by the Center for Geopolitics. So I feel, as it were, as the director, that I need to take you up on this a little bit and do my best. And I suppose the question one might put would be, it's true that the argument is not framed in terms of say, India or the overseas, and people aren't really concerned about that. But people are, in general, in Britain, concerned about Europe, the rest of Europe. And I just wondered whether an argument, the treaty itself, the Utrecht Treaty, the wider framing, of course, that is challenged very much on geopolitical grounds, as well as on the economic grounds that the associated economic treaties. So I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit more about the geopolitics around the trade treaties, the Methuen Treaty, the other treaties. What is the wider framing there that we should be bearing in mind?
So you're absolutely right. It's part of the end of a wider geopolitical struggle over control of Europe. In this case, Spain and the War of the Spanish Succession. The Methuen Treaty with Portugal, and I didn't get a chance to explore this in the initial presentation, but I'm delighted to do so now. It does come up in a geopolitical context, right? Portugal initially wavers, having been a long-standing British ally, initially wavers from supporting Britain's claimant in the War of the Spanish Succession, and is then brought back on side by the ambassador Methuen, who eventually negotiates, or rather his father, the father-son team, which always makes history confusing, but by the same diplomatic mission that negotiates this commercial treaty. So it's a follow-up to an agreement to get Portugal on side in a geopolitical struggle. I'd like to loop back to that in a moment. In terms of the geopolitics of the Treaty of Commerce itself and the end, and you're right that there is huge focus being paid in the UK, as you know far, far better than I do, on the peace settlement and what it is and how it functions, and that is a very partisan moment. What is interesting about this treaty is that it is not a partisan vote. 40% of those rebelling on the treaty vote are Tories. Most of those Tories are in favor of the peace settlement and entirely supportive of the geopolitical aspect of bringing the war to a halt and the concessions that are won in the wider Treaty of Utrecht. Their concerns are specifically commercial and influenced by that separate commercial debate. So this is often talked about as a period of the rage of party, and yet here we have, and again, this has huge parallels to today, international trade being one of the only things that causes massive splits in party affiliation. And when the election that follows occurs, the general concept is that there's a lot of sort of wavering Tories, and we know this because pamphlets would be sent out showing the lists of how people voted on the treaty, categorizing them and asking people to bear that in mind when they vote. So we can see how people were viewed, and they were viewed as a lot of the rebels who defeated the treaty were viewed as rebel Tories who agree on the politics, but not on the economics. To link this back to the Methuen Treaty, which is being negotiated in the aftermath of a geopolitical arrangement, the diplomat himself, Methuen, is the son of a clothier and somebody who grew up actually in Bradford in Devon, not that Bradford as it were, whose brother, I think, was still running a cloth mill. He was looked down on as coming from sort of humble background in some ways in the diplomatic service. And he would have been aware of the economic context independent of the political. Domestic producers had been asking for this kind of arrangement with Portugal as early as 1677, I think is the earliest I've found. So to take your point about the importance of geopolitics, I think it's right, but I would flip it. I would say that instead of the economic treaty being something done in service of the geopolitics, I think this was an advantage taken of a geopolitical moment where Portugal was coming closer to the UK to sign an economic agreement in the benefits of domestic English welfare. So I don't think the economics is being brought in service of the geopolitics. In fact, it was probably, I would argue, the other way around. And that's an interesting thing again for today, I think, in thinking about which ways round that jumps. And that's another reason why it's much harder than it can seem, I think, to isolate geopolitics from geoeconomics and different aspects of grand strategy.
Thank you very much. So in a minute, I'm going to broaden out the discussion a bit more into the present day and bring Mikael in on that particularly. But just one more question from me on the historical side. which is, if you like, on the intersection between cultural, geopolitical, and if you like, geoeconomic history. So later on in the 18th century, there's quite a lot of criticism from pamphleteers and clergymen and others around luxury imports of wine and other things, various textiles from mainland Europe, which are seen in some ways as sort of enfeebling and feminizing, unmanning the British, and making them weaker in the international sphere. Is that an argument that's advanced in the context of the Calico Acts, that you don't want somehow exotic luxury imports, which not merely are an economic challenge, but somehow also a cultural challenge to English virtues, and then weakening them in the European struggle? Is that an argument that's made at the time?
It is a bit, but I've been surprised that it's not dominant. It is bound up in particularly attacks on calico madams and ideas of rich female consumers, and we can link that in, as many historians recently have done, to wider debates in this period about a crisis of masculinity and associated things. I think the issue is that the economic debate is structured as such that if you are opposing the Calico Acts, you are championing domestic production of precisely the same product. So you are central to the debate at the time is that we want these effeminizing calicos to be made in England by English weavers and English clothiers. You can see this particularly in silk production, where people are criticizing Indian and actually French imports while championing precisely the same products being produced domestically. So the importance of domestic production and the weight that is put on domestic production limits the extent to which this can be linked to wider issues of class and of new global forms of fashion. But it is there a little bit.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to encourage the audience to send in questions. Some are already beginning to come in, but as I said at the beginning, you can use the Q&A function to put your question, and then I'll be very happy to come to it. But let's broaden out discussion a bit now. Mikael, you referred to the revival of mercantilism and mercantilist thinking in the present day. And the question here might be, how much of that do you think is a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the stresses of globalization? And how much of that do you think is actually historically informed, at least among its intellectual and political protagonists, by an understanding of past mercantilist models? How sort of educated is this new mercantilism? What's your impression?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. As how I see this kind of revival of mercantilist policies and this accelerating what I would call geoeconomic competition, where the great power rivalry really takes place in the economic domain, I see it as being conditioned especially by this structure of the international system that we have now. I guess I'm not a historian, but I would claim that probably the world has never been as interdependent ever before as we are today. And this has a lot to do why we see so much, I think, geoeconomics going on now, because it obviously raises the threshold for using military means because we're dependent on each other. So military means are difficult to use. But on the other hand, since we are so interdependent and there are all these interconnectivities, economic means become quite an effective means to influence others and pursue power political objectives. Because you can go beyond, around the state as well. You have these kind of connections into the other country's society. So if diplomacy was used to be, the Westphalian Treaty and so on and forth, we think of diplomacy as being state-to-state. But now we see the Westphalia failing a bit. And that has also to do with kind of what we call now the hybrid threats and those sorts of things. Subversion. We see more subversive politics as well, where states try to go around the other state to directly influence, interfere in another society and pursue their strategic objectives through this. And it has a lot to do, as I said, with the structure of international system and international relations today. It's interdependent and it's asymmetric. So in a symmetric world where everybody would be equally dependent on each other, we would probably see a lot of cooperation and we would see a more peaceful world. But now, since there are these asymmetries, you can use those asymmetries. There are power in those asymmetric interdependencies. It's an effective means to be used. So that's more of the sort of explanation I would look at when trying to explain the sort of revival of mercantilism or geoeconomic power politics, this sort of economic power politics that we see today. It has to do with this more of a structural explanation.
I would just pick up on that idea of asymmetries, and that being a prerequisite, if you like, for some of these more geoeconomic measures. Of course, in this context, and particularly in the context of the Calico Acts, we're talking about a period in which, while those economies, I mean, the Indian economy may have been far greater, the political asymmetry was such that there was no realistic possibility of, say, various Indian states at the time following British politics, seeing a particular act and responding in kind. We're not at that level yet. I think what is interesting, and this is where we get into whether these measures are inherently beggar thy neighbor or not. What is interesting is that if asymmetries are required for more aggressive measures, whether they be for domestic economy reasons or for more strategic reasons, that leaves those states not in a dominant position extremely vulnerable. And one wonders whether they're going to be increasingly vulnerable in the coming decades to being forced into one camp or the other via geoeconomic means. And if that is true, I think that will be extremely concerning for a lot of powers across the world.
Thank you. So, I mean, given the importance of the revival of these ideas, Pasha Ghaffari is asking, what are the myths? This will be, I think, in the first instance for you, Hugo. What are the myths surrounding England's mercantilist era? So, what are the things that we think we know but that are not true, that are actually influencing our view of the present day?
So I think there are two main myths that I touched on in the paper. The first is that mercantilism came from above, which I don't think is a sustainable position if you analyze this period. I think parts of it may have come from those higher relationships, but often it came from below, through popular pressure, through petitioning, through things like that, as I've hopefully described in this paper. And I think we need to recognize that in part because it challenges some of the wider narratives about the broader stretch of global history in this period, and particularly this moment that is so often highlighted in global history where India moves from being a global exporter of textiles, and that's this being a source of wealth, to a global importer, which is seen as hugely significant in the global economy and usually blamed, somewhat strangely, on the East India Company itself, which was very much not its intention, right? Its intention was to use Indian production to export to the domestic market. So I think the first myth is that it came from above rather than a mixture of above and below, with perhaps an emphasis on below. I think the second myth about mercantilism, and actually I find myself using this myth all the time, and we've used it on this call because I think the word has changed its meaning, is that it's fundamentally about a policy program, which we've now taken it to be, and I think we all use the word in that context now. But in its origin, it's about a process of policy formation. It's about influence between different groups, and it's about how things can be brought into service. And I don't think that's incompatible with geopolitics, because it is one thing to say, we wish to carry out an act of geoeconomics against one power or another. But in this world, how you carry that act out may rely very heavily on corporate interests, on other economic interests. who will have their own agendas and who will want particular things from that action. And if you look at the original Smithian understanding of mercantilism, it's very much about using patriotism against the interests of the majority of people. It's about using the idea that we want a strong, in this case, manufacturing sector to promote, in Smith's case, certain mercantile and manufacturing elites. So I think that the idea of relationships between business and the state and between populations, business and the state does need to be thought of when we're thinking about mercantilism and when we're thinking about geoeconomic decision making. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Mikael, or not.
Yes, indeed. I think you rightly point out the different levels here that we're dealing with. It's not only state to state level, it's also between the state and the economic interest corporation. It's also between our corporations and another state. I mean, there are those interests that they might have in common as well that are against the national interests of, say, Finland or Britain, right? So there are these different levels that we need to think more and coming also to how corporations themselves try to deal with this. Sometimes they are on board with the sort of state's geoeconomic strategy and it's perhaps even mercantilist policies. Other corporation might be against because it's not in their economic interests. So there is this kind of 2-level or 3-level game going on here, I guess, very much. I would perhaps still make one point on Brendan's question, and that's about kind of the knee-jerk reflex here as well a bit, is that I guess there's an argument for a state in this situation now for kind of balancing against dependencies in a way, right? If the usual idea of international relations is the balance of power, now we're perhaps seeing also a balance of dependence in a way, where states are waking up to the fact that they need to balance against too much economic dependence on another state, on China or the US or something, because otherwise they will become a target of geoeconomic power politics, or they will become a pawn in this power political game, right? So there's an argument to be made for balancing against these sorts of economic dependencies, and that's what we're seeing taking place now when states invoke more mercantilist policies, right? But there's of course the real risk that goes overboard, that goes too long, too far, and that states starts to rein in more and more sectors. What sectors are considered strategic in this means? More and more sectors are considered strategic, and suddenly we're in a situation where we don't, we decoupled completely because we're balancing so much against these dependencies. So there is, of course, this tendency now, this risk and this kind of threat in a way that, again, this knee-jerk reflex goes way over, and it turns into something quite other than doing something only for security or strategic reasons.
I think so. Oh, sorry, Hugo, just to slightly change direction here, because what's sort of one of the questions that are being asked is, of course, to do with recent events in the United Kingdom, and it's very striking that Mikael, you said that international trade policy, geoeconomics, is now the main instrument really of geopolitical pressure. At least it's the default one. So inevitably, I think we have to ask Hugo, do you see any lessons from the story that you have analyzed for a Britain today that is coming out of Brexit and is trying to pursue an independent foreign and trade policy? Is there any read across there? Any advice here for Liz Truss and Mr. Ron?
I think so. I think a few. Not and one wants to be very careful at this point not to overstate comparisons and links. To start with a more sort of recent one, I talked in my conclusion about the role of types of economic analysis in creating barriers between the wider population and international trade policy and economic debate. I think we saw that in the Brexit vote. 350 million a week is a narrative argument. Trying to estimate the amount of damage to the economy per person per year caused by the decision to leave the trading bloc is not. One of those was more effective and carried more weight than the other. I think, so that there's a lesson in the vote itself. We then have a question of what to do now and what it can teach us now. And I think maybe what the history of mercantilism does reveal is a tension in the Brexit coalition, and a tension that perhaps Liz Truss might be struggling with as we speak, between those who view it as a more protectionist enterprise, as allowing us to shift our economy, to develop industries that sustain more employment, and to act in that kind of way and rise as an economic power in that sense. And those who view it as an opportunity for further trade liberalization, the phrase Singapore on Thames, which I don't fully understand as a phrase, because I'm not sure it quite correctly reads the policies of Singapore, but the phrase is bandied around a lot to refer to a kind of deregulatory, ultra-free trade agenda. If those come into conflict, that I think would pit the London-based areas of the UK that have seen such high growth in recent decades against wider aspects of the Brexit coalition. Both things that are part of this current Conservative government. And as we start talking about something like the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, well, what can we offer the Indo-Pacific geostrategically? Well, one of the things we can offer is the city. We can offer financial support. We can offer investment that's limited by our own free market, right? And we've seen the limits of that with Standard Chartered and HSBC and their equivocations on Hong Kong in recent years. But that's what we have in the global economy. You can see that coming into tension with what a lot of people voted for when they voted to leave the European Union. So I'm sorry, I've answered a geopolitical question by talking about the domestic again, but I do think that tension is going to be really important in coming years. Heaven knows how it will resolve, but certainly when we had this tension in our society 300 years ago, it most definitely resolved in favor of a more protectionist outlook.
Thank you, and I think that leads very neatly into another question that's just come in. I think one that will also be one that Mikael will want to answer, and it's from Ike Fryman. And he asks, what does the phrase national interest even mean in this context, if the nation's economic interests can mean either one trade policy or another one that advances an entirely different set of geopolitical goals, which is, I think, a little bit what you were talking about there, Hugo. So, Mikael, would you like to have the first go at that?
Sure, thanks. The national interest is, of course, I don't think there's an objective national interest for any country. It's a matter of debate, and it fluctuates a bit based on who's in power at the time being, right? So let's take an example. Let's take US strategic interest in its alliance system, right? So for many in the US, right, the US alliance system is a core national interest or a core means to pursue some national interest for the US. Now, you can pursue that alliance, that national interest in keeping the alliances intact. You can pursue that by different means, geoeconomic means, for instance. So geoeconomically, that national interest can be pursued by coercing your allies, for instance. Say, if Japan is at the risk of taking more distance to the US or not keeping the US troops in Japan anymore, the US can coerce it economically, say that we put sanctions on you unless, right? And try to get them to acquiesce to that. Or the US can try to bribe Japan by offering economic carrots to keep the alliance intact and acquiesce to the US national interest in this case. Or another government, say a Trump government, might see the alliance system as not in the US national interest and pursue more mercantilist policies as a result, and trying to withdraw, isolate itself more by these mercantilist policies because it sees that as a national interest. So national interest is a matter of some sort of debate, and it can be pursued by different geoeconomic means, of course.
Thank you. And Hugo, did you want to add anything to what you've already said about the mutability of the national interest?
Only a little point, which is that what is being described perhaps in that distinction, but we've got through this conversation without mentioning Trump yet, so let's mention it now. What is being described in that distinction between someone like Trump and the provision of potentially economic carrots is a difference in balance to me in domestic considerations. Trump was actually may or may not have been consistent in this, but the purpose of it was to redress the balance in favor of American producers and American jobs, and to prioritize that ahead of alliances that may or may not have geopolitical benefits. And certainly corporate and political elites are going to have different conceptualizations of what approach to pursue to producers and employees in the home country. Now, the question is whether that's geopolitical or not. And without drawing any particular viewpoints from this, I think if we look at something like Joe Biden's foreign policy for the middle class, you can read that very geopolitically in the sense that we have to do certain things in the economic sphere, otherwise our domestic population will vote for a president who might blow up alliances. And in a democratic country, those two things are fundamentally linked. And if you offer too many economic carrots around that may damage your domestic economy, you are running a risk, surely, that what will follow is a domestic change in government that blows the whole thing up. So I think in that sense, the national interest is about balancing those concerns. And we will see whether they do it successfully in the present, or whether they make the same mistakes as states before.
So I come now to the last question, which I think is a tricky one, but will be in the minds of many watching this discussion, which is that the great geostrategic and geoeconomic clash of today, it's already been mentioned a number of times, is that between the PRC and the Western world, and particularly with the United States. Is there anything that either of the two protagonists, so President Biden, Mr. Xi Jinping, should be looking to coming out of the story of 1713? Who is even the power by analogy? Which is the China, which is the US of that time? How would one seek to apply some of those lessons today? Is that even possible or desirable? Hugo, do you want to have a first stab at that?
Okay. I don't think it applies directly in any particular way, but I think there's a conclusion for both sides to draw. One conclusion, particularly for the US side, is the prime importance that should be put on the domestic economy and on keeping the domestic economy strong and on securing jobs for American people. I think that's a moral imperative, but I also think it's a geopolitical imperative. I think a strong, healthy economy that balances good jobs with, in this modern age after the economic discoveries of the last 300 years, a considerable degree of free trade for cheap products for your consumers is a thing of geopolitical importance. And getting that balance right will be crucial, I think, for the US going forward. I don't think that's a particularly startling point. The idea of what this has to teach Xi Jinping is a hilarious and fascinating one. I made a sort of cursory link in the paper between Xi Jinping and Louis XIV, which I don't think I'm making in any wide context.
Mhm.
But I suppose all of these measures are vulnerable to corporate capture. All of these decisions are vulnerable to being distorted in particular interests of private groups. And if you don't have any wider popular participation in economic decision-making, then your actions as the state of China are, in a very Adam Smith-like way, in a very mercantilist way, to use it in the way to bring all the different definitions of mercantilism together, surely vulnerable to being co-opted by domestic Chinese capital and domestic Chinese economic interests. I am by no means an expert at all on that period today, and I would defer to a true expert as to whether that is happening or not. But I think surely it would be the lesson of this period is that it might be a concern.
Mikael, the last word is yours.
Thanks. Well, I'm of course not an expert on the Treaty of Commerce here, but what I was reading from, when listening to Hugo, I come to think of some lessons that we could perhaps think of in this. First of all, in my understanding, the government failed. It didn't get through its actual strategy that it was trying to pursue, right? Because of popular pressure and because the population as such was against it, the way it was conceived of. Now, there's an analogy perhaps that we can draw for today, that you need to get the population on board. You need to mobilize the population for that. If you are going to pursue a geoeconomic strategy like that, you have to get the right kind of stakeholders on board. And whether that is more difficult in a democracy in comparison to a autocracy like China, it's an interesting question, of course. Whether the US or Britain or the European Union or Finland or anybody else would see it more difficult to actually pursue geoeconomic statecraft because we live in democracies where there are contention and contentious politics. And whether China in that case has an advantage actually in this sort of strategic game. I guess many would say that yes, an autocracy, an authoritarian regime has an advantage in this sense. But I think we shouldn't exaggerate that advantage either. Because, I mean, for instance, when we look at how China can use its big corporations and economic corporations to pursue certain strategic objectives, it's not as straightforward as always portrayed. There are a lot of contention there as well. There are a lot of the Chinese, even state-dominated companies that are not effective implementers of the Chinese regime strategy, actually. I've seen a lot of research lately that actually show that there's a lot of foot dragging, there's a lot of objection, and so that the strategy is perhaps not as coherent as often portrayed. Whereas democracies can actually be quite effective sometimes in pursuing strategies, because once all are on board, there might actually be a very kind of strong sense of going and strong buying into that strategy, in fact. So that's what I would like to perhaps point out as kind of a last one.
Thank you very much indeed. There's so many questions, I think, we could still ask and explore, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. I need to draw this now to a close, not before doing two things. First of all, to remind our audience that they should please stay tuned to the Center for Geopolitics, register if you haven't already done so for our mailing list. You can also watch this discussion on video on our websites and the other websites in due course. And secondly, of course, I'd like to thank all of those who've helped make this event possible. John Freeman in the background as the assistant with the webinar, of course, our partners, and most of all, our two splendid panelists. I'm extremely grateful to you both. But for now, that's it from us.
Thank you.